Hej, välkomna tillbaka. Hello, welcome back. I'm going to sing a little bit more eager song for you this time. We began cool and calm this morning, but I think we all need a little bit kick off after a lunch. Is that so? Yes. Yeah, okay. So here you will hear a song that I wrote in my home dialect, the dialect that Gunnar spoke about, that no one Swede will understand except for them who comes from this region in northwest Dalecarlia, Älvdalen. It's about if you feel sad, you should turn to the sun during the day and to the moon during the night, because then you will get your power back. Rawig, rawig. Wanda wet du good, wanda wet du far. Rawig, rawig. Tassur ganzi quida, gredinen kumbat. Tassur ganzi quida, gredinen kumbat. You said I'll wig, 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 wig. You said I'll wig, daddy. I'll be walking out. Ratunglet fidi banoti kumbe. Rawig, rawig. Wanda wit du good, wanda wit du far. Rawig, rawig. Tast surganze quida. Gredinen kumbat. It's at it. Tassur ganzi quida. Gredinen kumbat. You do that. He said I'll wig, 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 wig. He said I'll wig, daddy. Nu Susanne. Ratfidi shiva varanikum. Rawig, rawig. Wanda wet du good, wanda wet du far. Rawig, rawig. Tassur ganzi quida, kredinen kumbat. Zare. Tas blue the wet klorta, live et kumbat. He said I'll wig, 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 wig. He said I'll wig, daddy. We said I'll wig, 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 wig. He said I'll wig, daddy. We said I'll wig, 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 wig. He said I'll wig, daddy. You said I'll wig, daddy.
Thank you, Lena. Did you sing Wake Up? Was it Wake Up? Wake Up?
A little wake up call for you all. Are you awake now?
Yeah. So now, welcome back to the afternoon session. We're really sorry for the delay, but it had to do with logistics at the restaurant. So the next speaker is Professor Zach Hambrick, professor in psychology at Michigan State University. His research is focusing on individual differences in cognitive abilities and capacities and how they contribute to performance, or as I've read, a formulation by you, how do people become great at what they do? I think you've said that. Yeah, you're nodding like this. And in your expertise lab, you are using state-of-the-art techniques to explain differences across people. Among appreciations for your achievements, I must mention the New York Academy of Science Award for Best Dissertation. That's a good one. So please, Zach, we are really looking forward.
Okay. Well, thanks so much to the Karolinska Institute for putting this on, and particularly to Fredrik Ulle for inviting me. So, let me see how I advance here. I'll start with an uncontroversial observation, and that is that there is massive variability in human skill. So this is to say that very few people who take up something like music or a sport or dance reach an expert, much less an elite level like these people. So let me give you a couple of striking examples of exceptional performance. The first is the Danish chess great Magnus Carlsen. Oh, is that right? Okay, Norwegian. Sorry, can't get away with that here. The Norwegian chess great, Magnus Carlsen. So Magnus Carlsen learned the moves of chess at the age of 5. He took up the game seriously at age 8, which is relatively late for someone who reached his level of skill. He reached grandmaster status at age 13, was world number 1 at 19, and the highest rating in history at age 24. As of April 2016, he was world number 1 in classical, rapid, and blitz chess. So here's a graph showing Carlsen's meteoric rise to chess greatness in terms of his rating. So here's another example. This is the American ballerina Misty Copeland. So Misty Copeland started ballet at the very late age of 13 with no prior experience even in gymnastics. Only 2 years later, she won the Los Angeles Spotlight Award at age 15. She was a member of the American Ballet Theater at age 18. She was the American Ballet Theater soloist at 25, and presently she's the principal dancer. Now, there's some similarities between Magnus Carlsen's and Misty Copeland's stories. So they both have invested an enormous amount of time in becoming experts, albeit much more quickly than most people. But there are also some interesting differences. So Carlsen has the sort of upbringing that you might expect of a prodigy. So very nurturing parents. His father played chess, introduced him to chess. His parents devoted a great deal of resources to developing his career in chess. Misty Copeland, on the other hand, has a very different story. So when she began ballet dancing, she was living in a single room in a motel in Los Angeles. She had to walk to ballet practice. Her mother actually at one point encouraged her to stop dancing. So these differences in the sorts of stories of exceptional performers, I think highlights the multivariate nature of expertise, which is really a theme of the work that I've been pursuing. So it suggests that there's probably not a single factor that's contributing to differences across people in expertise, and maybe even that there are multiple routes to greatness. So the science of expertise seeks to explain this striking variability in human skill. So what are the factors that account for at least some of the variance across people in high-level skill? So this question is not a new one, and it long predates psychology. So in the Odyssey, Homer said, "So it is that gods do not give all men the gifts of grace, neither good looks, nor intelligence, nor eloquence." Now, the first psychologist to take a strong stand on the big question in this debate, which is born versus made, was Francis Galton. Francis Galton was the founder of the scientific study of individual differences. And Galton, though he popularized the phrase nature versus nurture, he also made it very clear where he stood in the debate. So he said, "I have no patience with a hypothesis occasionally expressed and often implied, especially in tales written to teach children to be good, that babies are born pretty much alike and that the sole agencies in creating differences between boy and man are steady application and moral effort." So he also went so far as to say that social hindrances cannot impede men of high ability from becoming eminent, and social advantages are incompetent to give that status to a man of moderate ability. So Galton was taking a very strong hereditarian view. He was saying that eminence, by which he meant exceptional accomplishment, arises from a natural ability, as he put it. So Galton based this view on a survey of genealogical records. So he looked at the family trees of about 1,000 eminent individuals, scientists and painters, judges, musicians. And what he found is that they tended to be related to one another. So he noted, for example, that there were far more than 20 eminent musicians in the Bach family, JS being only the most famous. Here was his entry for the artist Titian. So he said, there are 8 or 9 good painters in this remarkable family. All of those whose names appear in the diagram are painters. The connecting links indicated by crosses are singularly enough, every one of them lawyers. So here we have a family of artistic lawyers, apparently. Okay. Now, the pendulum throughout the history of psychology on this question of born versus made has swung from one extreme to the other. And so by the early 1900s, it has started to swing in the other direction. So Thorndike, a pioneer of the scientific study of learning, countered Galton, saying, when one sets oneself zealously to improve any ability, the amount gained is astonishing. We stay far below our own possibilities in almost everything we do, not because proper practice would not improve us further, but because we do not take the training or because we take it with too little zeal. So here we have Thorndike emphasizing more of a role of effort and application. And so finally, Watson took this argument to its logical extreme. So John Watson was the founder of behaviorism. And he famously said, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant chief, and yes, even beggar man and thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations. So less famously, Watson said, practicing more intensively than others is probably the most reasonable explanation we have today, not only for success in any line, but even for genius, perhaps alluding to Galton. So more recently, the Swedish psychologist Anders Ericsson has, very much in the spirit of Watson, argued that individual differences in ultimate performance can largely be accounted for by differential amounts of past and current levels of practice. So in particular, what Erikson, as you may know, has argued is that expert performance reflects deliberate practice, and he defines deliberate practice as engaging in some activity with the specific goal of improving performance. So he said, Erikson et al. Proposed the term deliberate practice to refer to those training activities that were designed solely for the purpose of improving individuals' performance by a teacher or a coach, an instructor of some sort, or by the performers themselves. So here we have the great Henrik Stenson, and here we have the even greater Annika Sorenstam, perhaps engaging in their own deliberate practice. So what deliberate practice is will, of course, vary depending on the domain. So in music, the example that comes from Erikson is practicing alone or with an instructor in this case. The same would apply for something like dance. Now, what about art? So what is deliberate practice in art? Well, it could be engaging in exercises to improve some sort of technique like the ability to represent the human hand. So Erikson has maintained this strong view over the past 25 years. So in 2007, he said that it is possible to account for the development of elite performance among healthy children without recourse to unique talent, genetic endowment, accepting the innate determinants of body size. This account, based on the expert performance approach, shows that the distinctive characteristics of elite performers are adaptations to extended and intense practice activities that selectively activate dormant genes that all healthy children's DNA contain. This is quite reminiscent, in more modern language, of Watson. So more recently, on Freakonomics Radio, which is the companion radio site, our podcast for the book, Anders Ericsson said this, and we will need audio here.
Here's Anders Ericsson again.
We actually find that with the right kind of training, any individual will be able to acquire abilities that were previously viewed as only attainable if you had the right kind of genetic talent.
Would it be fair to say that the kind of overarching thesis of your work is that this thing that we tend to call talent is in fact more an accumulation of ability that is caused by what you've labeled deliberate practice?
I think that is a nice summary here of what we're finding.
So this is sort of describing Watson's experiment almost. I have to say I don't actually know what evidence he is referring to here. At least in my opinion, there's no evidence published to date that would warrant this sort of strong conclusion. So others have been sort of skeptical of this very strong position on expertise as well. Let me give you one example. This is Philip Ackerman, one of the world's experts on individual differences, commenting in a recent special issue of the journal Intelligence on expertise. So he said that until Erikson shows that cognitive expertise development in a randomly selected group of subjects, including those with moderate mental retardation, there's no reason to believe that such development can be accomplished. In the absence of such data, over 100 years of intelligence and educational results suggest that Erikson's claims should be taken with great reluctance because they may have highly disappointing results for parents and others who have great hopes, but no data on which to base such hopes. Now, the question that my colleagues and I have focused on in our research is, does deliberate practice account for all, nearly all, or at least most of the variance in skill in domains like chess and music and sports, professions, and so forth? As it should, if, as Erickson and colleagues have claimed, individual differences in performance can largely be accounted for by deliberate practice. And so I'm going to tell you just briefly about a series of meta-analyses that we've done to address this question. A meta-analysis synthesizes the results of multiple studies to arrive at more precise estimates than single studies. The major inclusion criterion for these meta-analyses was measures of one or more activities interpretable as deliberate practice and of performance were collected. Okay, so here are results from our first meta-analysis. This was on the domain of chess. Chess is the original domain for research on expertise. And so we thought, well, this would be a very good place to start. So we identified 6 studies that met our criteria. And the question here was simply, how strong is the correlation between deliberate practice and skill? Is it perfect, near perfect, or is it considerably weaker, suggesting there's more to the story than deliberate practice? And the answer for chess is that indeed there appears to be more to the story. Deliberate practice accounted for about 34% of the individual differences across people in expertise, leaving 66% unexplained and potentially explainable by other factors. In music, we found about the same thing, 30% of the variance. So recently, of the variance across people, right? 30% of the variance. So more recently, we will any day now have a paper coming out in Perspectives on Psychological Science. We looked at sports. We found 33 studies, 2,800 or so subjects, and overall, deliberate practice accounted for 18% of the variability across people in sports skill. Now, this is without correcting for measurement error. The estimates would be a bit higher if we accounted for the fact that no measure in psychology, certainly of the type that we're considering here, aren't perfectly reliable, but they wouldn't be much higher. And this is true regardless of whether we look, for example, at objective versus more subjective ways of evaluating people's expertise. So the studies that had an objective performance measure, like time in a race, about 20% of the variance, and also a similar estimate for individual solitary deliberate practice as opposed to sort of team or group activities. So again, the story that emerges here is that deliberate practice is an important piece of the puzzle, but there are other pieces as well. So what about evidence from artistic domains? Well, not much work has been done on this to date, but there is a little bit. So Erickson and colleagues published a study in 2014 on ballet. They had subjects from several highly regarded ballet companies. The range of expertise was principal in international company at the very highest level to no professional position. So they found that the correlation between practice aimed at improving technique, in other words, deliberate practice, and level of expertise was 0.5, and that translates into 25% of the variance explained. So recently there was a study published on drawing ability. So in this study they had a large sample, 302 art students and other artists, provide measures of painting and drawing experience, their drawing techniques. They had them do actual drawing tasks to measure objectively their drawing ability. They had them self-rate drawing ability, and they also measured personality and intelligence. Okay, so this is a path analysis showing how some of these variables relate to each other. And you can see that the amount of time that they had engaged in drawing predicted the use of techniques that they would learn in formal instruction, okay? That in turn predicted actual drawing ability. So the point to take home from this is that these values aren't trivial in magnitude, but they're not gigantic either. So drawing techniques accounted for about 7% of the variance in actual drawing ability, meaning there are a whole lot of other factors, presumably, that are operating. So the conclusion that we've drawn from this work is that deliberate practice is important, but not as important as Erickson and colleagues have argued. So to put it another way, deliberate practice is an important piece of the expertise puzzle. It's only one piece of a complex puzzle. Now, two quick caveats. So the first is that the case for deliberate practice is based largely on cross-sectional evidence. That means that we bring into the lab experts and novices, we have them report practice, and we see how much they differ in practice, okay? So the problem with this is selective attrition. So it could be that people drop out of a domain and quit practicing because they're no good at it. The second issue, or the second caveat, is that the case for deliberate practice is based largely on self-reports of practice. So people are being asked to think back to the beginning of their careers, early in childhood in some cases, and to estimate how much they practiced. Well, our memories aren't probably that good, most of our memories. Okay, so what do? Well, we could estimate our practice based on our current level of skill. Okay, so if you've read a book with a title like Talent is Overrated, you might say, well, I'm pretty good, and it must be because I engaged in 10,000 hours of practice, like Malcolm Gladwell said I must have in his book Outliers. Okay, so these are two critical caveats to the case that's been made for deliberate practice, and neither of these has been put to rest definitively. The relationship between deliberate practice and expertise could be stronger than we think. It could also be weaker than we think. Okay, what are the other pieces of the puzzle? I'll consider briefly 4 different classes of factor. So ability factors, basic capacities and cognitive structures, dispositional factors, in other words, personality, genetic factors, and task and situational factors. So if you know a music teacher or are a music teacher or an art teacher or even a school teacher, ask them and they'll readily attest to the fact that some kids advance more quickly than other kids, almost from the very beginning. So we have people who progress very slowly, low talent, the average, people who progress fairly quickly, high talent, and then the extraordinarily talented who are just on another level, seemingly almost from the very beginning. In some cases, these people are what we call prodigies. So a prodigy, of course, is a child who performs at a level well above same-age peers. So in music, the classic example is Mozart. In art, a classic example is Picasso or maybe Monet, it turns out. So a prodigy who has been studied in the literature on giftedness is named, or was named, Nadia. And here we have some of her drawings from around the age of 5 or 6. So obviously way beyond what a typical child is doing at this age. This is my favorite. This is Chicken. It's age 6. Okay, so what do we know about prodigies? Maybe because they are so extreme, this is a good place to start in trying to understand the origins of exceptional performance. Well, we don't know that much because prodigies are, of course, very rare. Some of the best work to date has been done by Joanne Ruthsatz at the Ohio State University, and she recently published a book called The Prodigy's Cousin. So she has probably the largest sample of prodigies in the world. This includes 5 in music, 8 in art, and 5 in math. And she has administered an intelligence test to these 18 prodigies. So the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scales, and includes fluid reasoning. This is basically analytical reasoning ability. In other words, solving novel problems. Knowledge, this would include vocabulary and general information. Quantitative reasoning. Visual spatial thinking, so for example, being able to mentally transform an object in the mind's eye. And then a full-scale IQ estimate, which is a composite based on these subtests. Okay, so let's look at a profile of just one of the prodigies, one of the art prodigies. So she notes at the time of testing, prodigy 7, a self-taught painter, was 19 years of age. Although she had been interested in arts and crafts for as long as she could remember, she did not begin to paint until she was 13 years old. She said she was inspired by young art prodigies she saw on television. After just 18 months of painting, the prodigy won the National Gold Key Award, the most prestigious art award given to high school students, at the age of 15. She was one of 50 recipients of the award across the country. At 19, her work is selling for thousands of dollars and is displayed in prestigious art museums around the world. Okay, so let's take a look at the profile of cognitive ability scores for these individuals. All right, so this is for art. And you can see that for full-scale IQ, as well as fluid reasoning knowledge, quantitative reasoning, visual spatial skills, they are around average, maybe a little above average, or actually a little below average, surprisingly, for visual spatial skills. But they're way above average, above the 99th percentile for working memory. For music, same basic pattern. A bit above average for the others, way above average for working memory. Now for math, they're higher across the board on the scales. And then this is the entire sample. So if there's a distinguishing factor here, it would appear to be, at least for art and music, it would appear to be working memory. So take a look at this contrast. For full-scale IQ, the percentile scores range from the 50th percentile to the 99.9th percentile. For working memory, 15 of 18 of the prodigies had a score above the 99th percentile. And the others, the 3 others, were very high as well. So what is this working memory then? Maybe this is a good focus for research on exceptional performance. So at least according to one perspective, working memory is the ability to focus attention on information critical to performing a task. This could be the goal of the task you're trying to perform. It could be what I'm saying as opposed to noticing what the person sitting next to you is up to. The person who has developed this view is my colleague and mentor, Randy Engel. So Engel has argued over the past 3 decades or so that working memory is really more about attentional capacity than memory capacity per se. Being able to hold some task-critical information in a highly active and accessible state, and particularly under conditions of distraction or interference of some type. So let me tell you about just one study that is relevant to this perspective. So the basic setup in these studies is you first administer people tests of working memory capacity to gauge their level of this construct. These are 3 examples of working memory tasks, and in each, you're trying to remember some information while you're also dealing with distraction in the form of an intermittent distracting task. So for example, on the left, you can see that you're solving simple math equations, and then you're remembering a letter. You get another one, you remember another letter. So at some point you get a cue, and what you're trying to recall are these letters. So this is a typical assessment of working memory capacity. Now, the second step in these studies is to give people an attention task to measure their ability to focus their attention. This is a classic example. It's called the Stroop task, and your task is to name the color ignoring the word. So this, you would say blue, red, purple, green, oh, I made a mistake, orange, blue. Okay, it's hard. Now, if you really want to mess with people, what you do is something like this. You make most of the words congruent, so red, yellow, green, blue, purple, and then you throw in an incongruent word like this, okay? And this really gets people. It screws people up. They make a lot of errors. And that's particularly the case for people with low working memory capacity as opposed to high working memory capacity. So this is the error rate on those catch trials, those incongruent catch trials. It's as if you've lost the goal. Oh, geez, I was supposed to name the color, okay? All right. So how might this working memory capacity factor be involved in artistic expertise? Well, here are a couple of possibilities. So one is learning, often in distracting environments. We know that working memory capacity predicts learning outcomes. So also learning complex information like a sequence of dance moves. It could play a more direct role as well. Think about the intricate work that someone doing pointillism has to undertake. All right, so this is kind of the story. The idea is that working memory capacity could impact the acquisition of techniques, for example, through formal instruction. It could also impact performance directly. Okay, so another type of factor that might account for expertise differences are dispositional factors. So here we have the British artist Ben Jonson on spending 20,000 hours on this cityscape. Yes, I'm obsessed, he says. So we actually, surprising to me, know a good bit about the personality characteristics of artists. This is from a meta-analysis done by Feist, comparing artists and non-artists on a personality inventory. And I'll just go straight to the summary here. And here is Feist's verbal summary of the pattern of personality characteristics that artists differ from non-artists on. So artists are conflictive, impulsive, nonconformist, rule-doubting, skeptical, fiercely independent, and not concerned with obligations or duties. Although they are conflicted and rebellious, artists seek change, are easily bored, and yet see themselves as talented and worthy people. I don't know any artists like this. I don't know about you all. So I thought of Jackson Pollock when I read this description. Okay, so kind of more directly relevant to the question of expertise is the notion of what Ellen Wenner has called a rage to master. So she studies gifted children and has noted this distinctive personality profile in highly gifted children, including prodigies. So she says that they have a powerful interest in the area or domain in which they have high ability, mathematics, say, or art, and they can readily focus so intently on work in this domain that they lose sense of the outside world. So one component of this, I believe, could be working memory capacity. After all, we know that it's related to performance in focused attention tasks. Another possible component is what the psychologist Angela Duckworth calls grit. So she defines grit as persistence towards accomplishing very long-term goals. And in some collaborative work with Anders Ericsson, she looked at the impact of grit on success in the National Spelling Bee. She actually went to the National Spelling Bee and collected data from these kids. So she found that grit positively predicted engagement in deliberate practice. Okay? That in turn positively predicted spelling performance, so their success in the spelling bee. So I think an interesting speculation is that there are other factors that could have a direct effect. Okay, think about emotional regulation. You're up in front of a crowd of people and you have to control your response in this situation to be able to perform effectively. And in artistic domains, that certainly could be important. Okay. All of the variables that I've sort of identified as contributing to individual differences in expertise, including working memory capacity, grit, are substantially heritable. And we know this from twin studies. So the logic of a twin study is that monozygotic or identical twins share 100% of their genes, thus are genetically identical. Fraternal twins share only 50% of their genes on average. And so if a trait is heritable, identical twins will be more similar to each other on a measure of that trait than fraternal twins are. And that is indeed the case for working memory capacity and for grit. At least for working memory capacity, heritability estimates tend to be around 50%. Okay, so that is consistent with the possibility that expertise, the activities in which these traits play a role, might also be heritable. But this is indirect evidence, obviously, because all of these variables, working memory capacity, grit, and others, are substantially influenced by environmental factors too. So if a trait is 50% heritable, the other 50% is accounted for by environmental factors. So it would be nice to have a large sample of identical twin artists in order to look at the heritability of artistic accomplishment. Unfortunately, both twins and even more so highly successful artists are pretty scarce in the world. So we don't have these large samples to be able to answer this question. Now, this is a more sort of limited look at this, which I think is nevertheless really interesting. So this is a study done by Rosalind Arden, Robert Plomin, and others. So they had a large sample of twins in the UK complete what's called a draw a person test and a test of general intelligence at age 4, and then later again at age 10. So in the draw a person test, they're basically asked to depict a person, okay? And then their renderings are scored from 0 to 12 based on the presence of correct number of features, so head, eyes, nose, mouth, and so forth. This probably got a fairly low rating. Or this is a very abstract sort of portrayal. It's possible as well. Okay. So the question here is whether the MZ twins, the identical twins, are more similar to each other in their performance on this draw person test than the DZ twins. And the answer is yes, indeed, they are. So the correlation for the monozygotic twins is 0.55. The correlation for the dizygotic twins is 0.39. So a rough estimate of heritability is the MZ correlation minus the DZ correlation times 2. And applying this formula, you get 32% as the estimate of heritability for drawing ability. Okay, so last we come to task and situational factors. So people differ in their traits, their ability profiles, their personality profiles, and so forth, and tasks do as well. So some tasks are more complex than others. Take, for example, a domain of music. You have sight reading, but you also have playing from memory. So task factors of this sort could certainly impact artistic expertise. The context of the performance could also have an impact. And that's what I want to focus on for just a second here. So this is a study done in the late 70s by Teresa Amabile now at Harvard University. And so she had subjects perform a simple art task creating a collage conveying a theme of silliness. And the experimental manipulation was whether the subjects expected or not to be evaluated by a panel of judges. So half were told that their work would be evaluated by artists, and the other half were not. The finding was, whoops, the legend didn't show up. The finding was that the rated creativity, so all of the subjects were in turn actually rated by the panel of artists. Creativity was judged to be higher for the people who were not expecting to be evaluated than for the people who were expecting to be evaluated. So it was as if the apprehension around being judged hindered their creativity. Okay. Now, from our perspective, an interesting question is whether this sort of task and situational effect on expertise is moderated or altered by the sorts of individual difference variables that we've identified as being potentially important for expertise, including, for example, working memory capacity. All right. So if you're expecting to be evaluated, you might have this sort of internal dialogue. Oh man, this collage it's really terrible. They're going to really judge me harshly here. Okay, so that's a form of distraction and interference, right? So the hypothesis would be that subjects higher in working memory capacity are better able to inhibit or to suppress this negative self-talk than people with lower working memory capacity. Okay, so let me just close with some thoughts on how to advance the science of expertise. So I hope that you're sufficiently convinced now that we need to develop multivariate theories of expertise that take into account as many potentially relevant explanatory constructs as possible. We need to develop models that capture the richness and complexity of expertise, and this includes not only environmental variables, but also variables like intelligence, personality traits, sensory capacities that we know, based on a lot of research, are substantially heritable. So this sentiment was summed up nicely by Dean Simonton, who I think is one of the most eloquent commentators on this born versus made debate. Simonton said, "It is extremely likely that environmental factors, including deliberate practice, account for far more variance in performance than does innate capacity in every salient talent domain. Even so, psychology must endeavor to identify all of the significant causal factors behind exceptional performance, rather than merely rest content with whatever factor happens to account for the most variance." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach. And we have time for a couple of questions. Are there any questions? Where? Here we have one. You have the microphone, please. Hello?
Yep.
No?
Is it working? Hello, hello. I have 1 year in Granville, Michigan.
You had what?
1 year in Granville, Michigan.
Oh, Granville. Oh,
Yeah, so hello.
very nice.
Yes. And I hope my question is not based from my experience there, but I'm going to ask you a tough one now.
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
When I listened to this, and also when I listened this morning, how history has swayed between the born and the learned.
Right.
And there is also a little baby here today. She's like 1.5 months old. When the music starts, her face is going calm, and her eyes are like like this. And what I don't hear when you're talking about this, I don't hear any trace of, the ease and the silent in the moment of learning. When you have the true flow from the heart up to the brain, the one that can only be given from someone around you. Have you ever thought about that thing?
Well,
because
yes,
since of this Michigan also
yes.
thing, with the predestination thing and everything. So I just need to know.
I have thought about this a little bit in a somewhat different way. Okay, let me tell you how. So this deliberate practice notion, which I've been interested in for a long time. So the characteristics of it are that it requires maximum concentration. It requires, and it also is not enjoyable. Okay. And Erickson has argued that this is the key predictor of expert performance, whereas other activities that don't meet these criteria are not, okay, such as playful engagement in a domain. And so I've been skeptical of that claim. So do we really not gain anything when, for example, we're very young and we're purely for pleasure, we're playing the piano, we're playing a sport, and there's actually some evidence to suggest that actually these activities are predictive of later performance. And these are the sorts of activities that would be more likely to engender this sort of flow state. So I'm completely open to the possibility that the sort of activity that you're talking about could be, sure. If you want to think of it that way, sure,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Can we have a second question? We are running a little bit late because we have time for the...
Thank you very much. It's very interesting with motivation, I think. And you have mentioned a lot about that. So, or interesting things here. Do you do research on love, or what do you define the word love as?
Love?
Yes.
No.
Or do you have any project about
No, that's
that?
a hard one.
Okay. Yes. Do you have a project about
No.
that? Research?
I don't have a project on love.
I only have one question.
But I will say that I think in terms of my research on expertise, I think that this notion of grit, now the jury is sort of still out on the validity of this perspective. I think there is sort of an element of that in grit, right? So it's persistence and passion towards a long-term goal. So I think that for anyone who becomes a true expert, an elite level performer, that almost must be present, I would suspect.
Well, yeah.
Okay. I don't know. I think that we do know about grit that it is substantially, though not entirely, heritable. So there might be a predisposition towards becoming sort of high in grit, but of course there are going to be environmental influences on this too.
Okay. Come. Well, we can't hear you. So. Can we have a question up there?
Yeah, so thanks for a great presentation. My name is Martin Schalling. There are a few scientists here in the room, and I wanted to touch upon the issue of the anticipation of being evaluated. That happens to scientists occasionally, or quite often actually.
Right.
And
Right.
you had some whopping data showing that if you have an anticipation of being evaluated, then the creativity level goes down. And that's, of course, not good for all of us writing grant applications. So the question is here, do you have any model or idea of how to bring this information to the good of the scientific community? How do we avoid reducing creativity in the anticipation of evaluation?
Yeah, that's a really tough question. I think about this all the time when I'm evaluating students, and I tell them about this work, and then I say, I'm sorry, but I have to. This is the rule here at this university. I don't know. I mean, there are, at least in the United States, there are a handful of universities that are non-traditional in the sense that they don't award grades. There are no grades. This makes it very difficult when these students apply to graduate school. We'll get applications from them. So what do you do? So there is this balance between grades serve a useful role for selection or admissions, but then on the other hand, there is this potential downside, and I guess I don't know the answer. It would require such a massive overhaul of the system. I would be curious to know in this country, what is the emphasis on, for example, at the university level on grades. At the university level in the United States, it's like an illness that afflicts many students. They're so concentrated on getting a grade. A, they become intensely anxious, and B, perhaps as a consequence, they don't learn very much. Is that what's sort of the emphasis here? Huh. And how does it work? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I think that we can continue the discussion maybe during coffee time.
Okay.
Because now I think we have to continue with the program, and we thank you very much indeed for your talk. And now, next on the program is a percussionist, Johnny Axelsson, playing Xenaki's Rebounds B. And I would like to read a little bit about Johnny Axelsson. He's one of the great percussionists, and he's both arranging and composing work, and has work dedicated for him. And his solo CD, Percussione con Forza, was chosen to be the International Record Review to be the best contemporary music CD year 2000. Xenakis received the Polar Prize in 1999, and Fredrik Ulle's critically acclaimed Stockhausen CD, together with the percussionist John Axelsson, was used as the official Stockhausen presentation at the Polar Prize ceremony. So Johnny Axelsson, wherever you are, please. the next speaker is our own Fredrik Ulle. He's a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the KI. And he's also a famous pianist with several recordings, and he has given concerts both national and internationally. His research focus is on the effects of musical training on the development of the brain, and these musical training effects are rather dramatic. The recent activities have included studies using the twin registry at the Karolinska in order to identify the role of genetic factors on abilities and creativity. And Fredrik, the title of your talk is Music as a Window to the Creating Brain. Please, Fredrik. There you are.
All right. Thank you very much, Gunnar, for this kind introduction. And being one of the organizers, I'd really like to thank everyone for coming. It's wonderful to see this huge interest in our field. And of course, many thanks also to our guest musicians and not least to the other lecturers who have come a long way here. It's an honor really to speak in this company. So I think one important theme or message perhaps of this day is that looking at the arts, studying the artistic brain is relevant for science, medical science in more than one way. Obviously the arts are very interesting in themselves. We are talking about uniquely human, probably phenomena that engage an enormous amount of people. Of course, we would like to understand more about the biological and perhaps even evolutionary basis of aesthetics. There's also the promise of finding new interventions that involve arts in one way or another, and that may prove useful for cognitive abilities, well-being, maybe even health. There are quite a few promising results there. But I would still like to emphasize a third aspect, namely the perspective of basic science, because I think it's really striking to think of that it's almost difficult to think of a brain system that's not involved in artistic performance, one way or another. So if we are interested in the sensory system, sensory processing, movement control, emotional systems, social interaction, higher cognition, and so on and so forth, looking at artists and looking at artistic behaviors can turn out very useful. And in my talk, I would basically like to illustrate this point by discussing two examples in a way, or where I think using music as a model has advanced our understanding first of skill learning and expertise in general. So I will continue a bit along the same track as Zach. And my second example will then be creativity. As you heard from Zach, expertise is indeed a highly multifactorial phenomenon. It depends on many different variables in complex interactions. But still, an important piece of the puzzle, as you heard, is training. And I would like to focus on the importance of training for musical expertise. This is one example from an early study by Ralf Krampe and Eriksson showing the practicing habits of two groups of musicians through life. So you have the professionals here, that's the upper curve, and those who ended up as amateurs are here. What you see is the weekly amount of practice through life. And the professionals tend to start earlier, they practice more already in childhood. Later on in life, you make your professional choices and so on. So the total area under these curves differ a lot. And it's quite clear from the literature that one consequence of this massive practice is then quite drastic reorganizations of neural circuitry that contribute, importantly, to the fact that experts can perform much, much better than beginners within their particular field of expertise, music in this case. So I'd like to start by showing you some key findings from the literature on the brain of musicians, illustrating these relations then between neural findings and practice in the musician group. And this is one A pioneering study from the group of Gottfried Schlaug, Christian Gasser and Schlaug made this, and here they compared the anatomy of brains of professional musicians, amateur musicians, and non-musicians, and they focused on the gray matter of the brain, which is located to a large extent in the cortex, so the outer part of the brain, and that's where we have the cell bodies of the nerve cells. And the colored regions here then represent parts of the brain that were larger in size, simply in the musicians. We see these effects where we would expect them. These are regions that are involved in planning and executing movements. Here we have the auditory system, but also in some other places. Here's a famous brain region, Broca's region, which is important for language, but also for music and indeed for sequential organization of behavior in general. Now, one interesting aspect of these findings is that, at least in part, they are quite specific to the type of musical training that you're actually engaged in. This is another study from the Schlaug team where they compared two groups of musicians, namely string players and pianists. And yeah, you may have noticed in the morning actually that we do quite different things at the instrument. So string players use the left hand to shorten the strings, so you get a lot of finger movements with the left hand, a lot of stimulation of the fingertips of the left hand. The right hand controls the bow. Pianists obviously play with both hands a lot of finger movements, but in general the right hand tends to have a more busy role to play more notes. And what they found in this study when focusing on the motor region of the brain, on the hand motor areas of the motor cortex, was a difference, namely that in the string players this hand motor representation was more developed on the right side, which controls the left hand because you have a crossover in the system, whereas in the pianists they found essentially the opposite pattern. And of course, this suggests then that playing this instrument may have had a causal effect on the anatomy of the hand motor area, arguing from common sense. Of course, it's possible that if you have this kind of brain, you are more attracted to string instrument, but it seems somehow likely that we have to do with a causal effect here. I'll return to this point. There is also indications of causal effect from longitudinal studies where you follow people over time and collect data on several time points. This is a very nice study by Krista Hyde and co-workers where they looked at two groups of children. One group had chosen to start learning an instrument, so they trained for 15 months. The other group did not, and these children were scanned on two occasions, then first at the outset and then after this period of training. And what they found was that several of these anatomical effects appeared to develop over time in the playing group as compared to the non-playing group. And here you see this effect on the motor area developing over time. And interestingly, they also found a relation between this anatomical effect and behavior, so performance on a motor task, where you need to use both hands. And such relations between brain anatomy and function has been found for other areas as well. I picked this example from the nice work of Peter Schneider and co-workers on the auditory cortex. So what you see here is the size of the auditory cortex, which then processes musical sounds and other sounds in the brain. On this axis, we have result on a quite difficult test of musical perception, so how well you can discriminate melodies and rhythms and such things. So every symbol here is an individual, a participant, and you can see they found a quite strong relation between brain anatomy and auditory function in this case, including both musicians and non-musicians. More than 10 years ago now, we were interested to see if we could find similar phenomena in the other part of the brain, so to speak, the white matter, which then contains connections between brain regions. So we looked at a group of concert pianists, highly concert active musicians, and compared them with a control group of non-musicians. We recorded extensive data on their practicing habits, and we also scanned their brains using a technique which was fairly new at the time called diffusion tensor imaging. It's a special magnetic resonance imaging technique which is useful if you want to look at the ultrastructure of white matter. And I think what you see here is arguably the most important finding of the study. So when we looked at this part of the brain, which is the main pathway connecting motor areas from the brain to the spinal cord, the pyramidal tracts, These tracts were more developed in pianists as compared to non-musicians, and we also found a relation within the pianist group between structure of these tracts and practicing in childhood. In Krista High's study, they also found examples of how white matter appeared to develop over time in the children who practiced. This example here shows the corpus callosum, one part of the corpus callosum, which is then the major, large connection between the left and the right brain, between the two hemispheres. Similarly here, they had a relation between this effect and performance on a motor task. So to sum up this little introduction, there's a fairly large literature today showing that musical training is indeed correlated with brain anatomy. We see this in the gray matter, where we have the nerve cell bodies, looking at volumes, cortical thicknesses. We see it in the connections of the white matter. In part, at least, these effects depend on exactly what you do at your instruments. I gave you one example comparing string musicians and pianists. Other studies have found differences, for instance, between instrumentalists and singers, suggesting that they are very tightly related to the kind of expertise that you have acquired. There is also longitudinal data then showing that if you compare people who train to groups that do not train, these effects, at least in part, appear to develop over time in the trainers. But of course, a very tricky question here, and I would like to focus on that for a while, is the issue of causality. Because most of these studies are actually based on cross-sectional data, and meaning then that you collect all the data on a single occasion. So we have training data and we have brain data or data on behavioral performance. Which means then that, of course, there could be several causal scenarios underlying this. One possibility, and I think most of us are a bit biased to believe that this is the case, namely would be then that musical training causes these differences in the brain or in performance. It's a very plausible hypothesis. Of course, the other way around is also possible, that if you have a brain with a particular structure, that makes it, you might be more able or more motivated and interested to play music. There's also an interesting third option, which is that none of these are true, but some third unknown factor simultaneously influences both your brain or your behavior and your tendency to practice music. Could be genetic constitution, for instance. And this is a problem for cross-sectional studies, but it's also a problem actually for observational longitudinal studies. And by this we mean that we study two groups over time, but the participants chose themselves whether they would be in the training group or in the non-training group. So we might compare, as in the example I showed you, a group of children who learned to play an instrument. They chose to do this with a control group who were not interested then. We record some data at the beginning, some data at the end, and then we see a difference between the groups. But of course, it's possible that this is caused by training, but unfortunately, it could also be caused by other factors which correlate with training, right? Maybe they differ in basic ability or interest and motivation or something like this. Well, as most researchers know, the sort of golden standard to attack this problem is, of course, to do a randomized longitudinal study. So you take a group of participants, you sort them randomly into two groups. They can't choose themselves. One group gets the training, the other one gets some suitable baseline task. You do the same thing, you record data at the beginning, at the end, and if you see a difference in this case, well, then you really have evidence for a causal effect of training. Now, the problem when we look at expertise is obvious, right? That we would like to have training going on for months, maybe even years. So it's difficult, if not impossible, to perform this kind of study. How can you sort of randomly assign people to practicing music or whatever in a dedicated way for years? It simply doesn't work out. And just to illustrate that this is not just a sort of philosophical or theoretical point, but a very real problem in the field, I would like to show you the results of one recent study that we did in the group, where the results really surprised us. So what we looked at here was then musical training and its relation to what you could call musical ear. So how well do you hear melodies, rhythms, and pitches? how well can you discriminate these kinds of sounds. It's a very well-known relation. It's been demonstrated in many, many studies that we have this relation. So if you train more, you perform better on such tests. Musicians outperform non-musicians. It's very common to assess this ability as part of the entrance exam to music colleges. So we decided to look closer then at the sort of nature of this relation. And we did this using data from a quite large Swedish twin cohort. This data collection was finished 3 years ago, or a bit more actually. So we have data from more than 11,000 twin individuals, adults. We collected quite a lot of different variables, as you can see, but I will focus here on data on music training. So we had extensive questionnaires on their musical background, their education, their upbringing, their training. We also measured then their ability, their musical auditory discrimination ability using web applications. All of this was done over the internet. And then we collected a lot of other things as well, as you can see, general psychology, health-related questions, and so on. So we ended up then with a quite large data set, which Miriam Mosing in the group analyzed. We had more than 1,200 complete monozygotic, identical twins, pairs, more than 1,300 dizygotic pairs, and then several thousand single twin individuals as well. And the measures we used then was, okay, total hours of music practice through life, these were adults, and the results on this test of music discrimination. So how well could they hear melodies, rhythmic patterns, single pitches? Well, if we just look at the behavioral data first, so this is not twin analysis at all, this is just how it looked behaviorally. We saw, as expected, a positive relation between training and performance on this test. So what you see here, these values are simply correlation coefficients. They vary between 0 and 1. 1 would mean a perfect relation, 0, no relation at all. And these are positive, so it means that the more you train, the better you perform on these tests. And the tests also correlate positively with each other. Just as a sort of side note in relation to what Zach told you, if you square these values, they aren't that huge. It's only like 5 to 12% of the variance in ability, which is actually explained by training in this case. Measurement error surely plays a role, but still it indicates that other things matter, as Zach emphasized. Anyway, you already heard a little bit about the possibilities with twins. You can do many different models. One of them is simply called the classical twin design, and the basic idea here is kind of simple. You compare monozygotic, identical twins with dizygotic twins, and the monozygotic twins in this case they will share all genes as well as a common environment of upbringing. The dizygotic twins share on average 50%, so they are like ordinary siblings. And the basic logic here is that if monozygotics are more similar in some respect than our dizygotics, then that would indicate a genetic influence. But what you do routinely today is to analyze this using structural equation modeling. So what you can get is actually statistical estimates of how important are genetic and non-genetic factors for the variability in a single variable, but perhaps more interesting, you can also look at the relations between variables. So in this case, we can look at the relation between training and musical ear and see what that depends on. If we start by just looking at the heritabilities, the results were quite interesting, we felt. So heritability then means simply the proportion of variability in this variable, which is explained by genetic factors in total. So we have a genetic influence of around 50%, you can see, on musical ear. That's not new, that's been shown in other studies as well. But what's striking, I think, is that we also have a substantial genetic influence on practicing itself. So how much you practice in reality is also influenced by who you are, your genetic constitution. And to our slight surprise then, we found that the relation between training and musical ear in this study was essentially driven by common genes. When we looked at the relation within the monozygotic twin pairs, so what you see here is an example from one of the tests, it's the rhythm test. It was not the case that the twin who trained more performed better on the test. So essentially, when controlling for all genetic factors and common upbringing, this relation vanished. So in this case, big surprise, this model turned out to be true. We were not looking at the brain here, but we were looking at behaviors, which obviously depends on brain function. So it's a tricky situation, and I just wanted to show you that together with Zach, we have tried to integrate the findings of this study and many other studies into a more comprehensive model of expertise, which is, to a large extent anyway, based on music as a model. So just to show you some main traits of this model. Practice is surely important, very important, perhaps the most important single variable. Practice can reorganize neural circuits that help us to perform better in our domain of expertise. It may also influence body properties like muscle strength. However, psychological traits influence our practice. So personality and interests may influence what we practice and how well organized our practicing habits are and so on. Importantly then, psychological traits can also influence expert performance independently of practice. And last but not least, we have to consider genetic and environmental influences and interactions between these on essentially all. We feel more complicated but also more realistic and more interesting view of expert performance. Okay, but I'd like to get back to this tricky question now. How can we sort of isolate or get closer to at least true causal effects of training and expertise? Because obviously they are there. Without training, you won't become an expert. Well, again, one possibility is actually to use twin modeling, and basically this model that I showed you briefly in the previous study, namely the monozygotic intrapair difference model. So again, these monozygotic twins share all genes and a common environmental upbringing. Let's say that we look at training and some kind of outcome, like musical ear, and we have a relation between these two. If the reason for this relation is that training causes the outcome, better musical ear, for instance, then crucially, we would expect this relation to stay significant within the twin pairs. What you see here, this is not real data, it's just simulated data, but what I plotted then is the difference in training within the pairs versus the difference in outcome. So, briefly put, the twin who trained more than would be expected to statistically also have a higher result on the outcome variable, if there's a causal relation. So we decided to get back to our large cohort and collect a much smaller sample in order to see if we could replicate some of these findings that I mentioned in the beginning on neuroanatomical differences between musicians and non-musicians. If we could replicate those in twin pairs with very different amounts of musical training. So we found and invited a much smaller sample of 10 complete twin pairs that were extremely discordant, as we say, for musical training, meaning then that they had a large difference in training. So in reality, the difference was more than 1,300 hours in total, and only the playing twin was still active in adulthood. The non-playing twin had quit practicing in adolescence, and they were right-handed and fulfilled other inclusion criteria for imaging and so on. You may wonder, okay, so why didn't you go for purely discordant twins, one of them playing, the other one not? Well, the reason is that they hardly exist. So we invited these 10 pairs from all over Sweden. They came for a weekend here to Karolinska, and we did a lot of additional tests. We are very grateful that they came here, obviously. And I'd like to show you something which came out there. First of all, we interviewed them, because of course it's interesting to try to figure out why they became so different in musical engagement in this situation. We looked at their behavioral capacities. It's interesting to see that the playing twins appear to have higher working memory capacity, but specifically for musical information only. We looked at the motor abilities and quite a bit of brain scanning as well. Yeah, why did they become different? Well, if we look at the questionnaire data, because they have taken the same questionnaires as everyone else in this cohort, two things stood out really. When we looked at personality traits, the playing twins here were much higher in a personality dimension called openness to experience. It's one of the major personality dimensions, and it has a strong component artistic interests. The other thing was that the playing twin reported much more frequent psychological flow experiences during musical activities. So what's that? Well, This state called flow is, I think most of you will recognize it. It's a kind of psychological experience which we can have when we do something actively which is challenging but not too difficult, and we enjoy doing it. And what can happen then is that we become very focused, very almost absorbed in the task, but it doesn't feel effortful to keep up this attention. We don't think of ourselves from the outside, we become one with the task, so to speak, and this is a very enjoyable state. Do you recognize this state? So that was very clear that the playing twins in this case had much more frequent such experiences during musical activities than their co-twins. Well, of course, this is kind of trivial in a sense. What I'm saying is just that, okay, they were more interested and they enjoyed music more, that's why they played more probably. So that's not so surprising perhaps. But what we did then in the interviews was to try to dig a bit deeper than what you can do with standard questionnaires. So we talked to them for 20-30 minutes around 5 main themes. First, what are your own thoughts about why you became discordant? We asked them, secondly, about childhood differences in a number of variables like musical listening habits, music teachers, music interests of the peers, parental engagement, and so on. Strong memories of music. What's the significance of music in your life? And finally, we also asked about how they perceive their interests and skills in language, which is, as we know, related to music in many ways. Well, the playing twins then gave more long and elaborate and detailed answers about the meaning of music in life. And unlike their non-playing co-twins, they emphasized in several cases that music is part of my personal identity. So obviously they had a sort of deeper relation to music in that sense. However, we found no systematic within pair differences in most of the other variables when it comes to peer interest, parental support teachers, playing habits, and so on and so forth. There was essentially no difference that they had to report. And the reasons that we got for the discordance were really very idiosyncratic and unique to each pair. I gave a few examples here. One pair could say that, well, I had more access to the piano than my brother. Well, I liked the music genre at home more than my sister. We had different needs for creative hobbies, different opinions about the teacher, and so on and so forth. So, kind of interestingly then, it seems that when you control for all genetic factors and for the common environment of upbringing, it can still happen that people develop profoundly different relations to music, but the reasons for that seem to be very difficult to pinpoint, kind of unsystematic in nature. And I think this sort of fits the general idea that non-shared environment might to a large extent be the consequence of the sort of cumulative effects of many kind of random environmental events. Yes, we scanned their brains as well, and we are about to finish this analysis now and write it up. Just to give you some examples then, indeed, we could see some of these differences that have been reported between musicians and non-musicians in these twin pairs. Here's one region that was larger in all pairs in the playing twin than in the non-playing twin. It's a region, it's a left temporal parietal junction, which is important for auditory motor coordination. This makes sense on the left side. We also found that the premotor areas, which are important for planning and controlling movements, were larger in the playing twins. There was a relation between these effects and how large the difference in musical practice was between the twins. Well, to our pleasure, we also replicated this early finding, which I mentioned, that the pyramidal tracts, if you recall, this main pathway for the control of finger movements was more developed in the playing twins, significantly so on the left side in all pairs, and we also had a trend on the other side. So, to sum this part then, discordant monozygotic twin provided a very interesting opportunity to study, well, pure training effects in a sense. At least we control for all genetic factors as well as the common environment of upbringing. So I think this is an important piece of the puzzle to understand what effects of training are causal as opposed to merely sort of correlated with training. So again, we found differences in both the gray matter and the white matter of the brain, which fit the earlier literature, as well as a higher working memory capacity specifically for music. I didn't have time to show this. Okay, in my last minutes then I would like to turn to a second example of where I think you can see how studying music has gave us some interesting knowledge about human cognitive functions in general. And in this case, I picked creativity then, and the model behavior that we use is improvisation, naturally. It's nice because I think it's ecologically valid. It's obviously an example of a real life creative behavior. It's also possible to study in using brain imaging, functional brain imaging, where we measure brain activity, given that you simplify life. I mean, obviously you would like to have something like this, but we end up with something like that. So we have this small, special-made 1-octave keyboard, which is possible to use in this highly magnetic resonance environment. And our participants, and I will have to say that almost all the pianists here in the Stockholm area have, I guess, been in this situation by now, so I'm very grateful for our enthusiastic participants as well. So we measure brain activity as they improvise, and we've done a number of studies on this. I would like to, just as an example, I picked one question which I think has some general interest, and that's namely, what is the role of the DLP-C for improvisation? What's that? Well, that's actually a very important and large brain area. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's situated here in the frontal lobe. It's a key brain region for what you could call cognitive control, so attention, working memory, selecting behavior, and so on. So we have done a number of studies on where we have classical pianists as participants, and we ask them to improvise. And generally, we have found that this region, which then is important for cognitive control and attention, is activated as they improvise. In the first case here, we had the pianist, they had to do create some ornaments, some simple melodies like this, and we compared that to when they played from memory, and we found higher activity in this region. We've also seen it when we compare improvisation with playing from a written score. So that makes sense perhaps, but to our puzzlement, or everyone's puzzlement, I guess, Charles Lim and Brown in a very nice study found exactly the opposite thing. So that's interesting. They looked then at jazz players who perform jazz improvisations, and the blue here means deactivation. So in fact, what they reported was that these regions went down in activity, even below resting level, as these jazz guys improvised. Okay, so what's going on? Well, guess an obvious possibility here was that specific jazz training could be a key variable here. So if you have expertise specifically in improvisation, maybe that has an impact on how the brain works as you improvise. That makes sense, I think. So Anna Luisa Pin, who was a PhD student in the group at the time, she is now finished, decided to check that. So we scanned 39 pianists. Some of them were pure classical players, as earlier, and then we had in the other extreme pure jazz pianists, and then other people with a more mixed background. We asked them to improvise under different instructions, and I won't have time to go into that. But one general question that we were interested in was then, how does the brain activity during this behavior vary depending on how much improvisation training you've had? Controlling statistically for conventional classical training. And well, to our pleasure then, we found indeed that in a number of regions that are important for cognitive control, including this DLP-C region, we had a negative relation between brain activity during improvisation and how much and degree of improvisational training. And in the most experienced improvisers, we found too that these areas deactivated as we improvise. So that's kind of interesting. It would mean then that prefrontal cortex, the involvement of prefrontal cortex in a creative behavior like improvisation depends on your specific experience. We also made a follow-up study that I won't have time to go into, but there we looked at differences between different kinds of improvisation. So in one situation, these pianists had to improvise in a particular mood or emotion. So we make a happy improvisation or a fearful improvisation, I believe. In this case, we found a lower activity in this area than if we told them to, okay, improvise, but you can only use these and these and these tones, a given pitch set. It's a more difficult task. There again, this region was switched on. So a sort of general idea that we are toying with here is that you might have different strategies for creative thinking that could depend on your level of task-specific expertise. So if you are really an expert on what you're doing and you get a task that you are familiar with, it's probably a good idea to lower top-down control, because in this case your spontaneous free associations will produce a good result. However, if you have a lower degree of task-specific expertise, you're a classical pianist, or you get this strange constraint on your improvisations, then it's dangerous to allow free associations and you need more cognitive control. And of course this is not, it's probably 2 points on a continuum. Okay, I would like to sort of wrap up then by just emphasizing that I think looking at artistic behaviors, looking at artists as subjects can be very interested, not just if you're interested in the arts, but also if you're interested in human cognition in general. The examples I gave you were first and from expertise, which is, I'd like to sort of emphasize that again, it's a highly multifactorial phenomenon. Gene-environment interactions are important, and if you want to sort of identify true causal effects of training, that's very difficult. You can't assume that just because training correlates with something, that's because training makes it happen. However, twins can be useful to disentangle such effect. Secondly then, we use music to look at creativity with improvisation as a model behavior, and one finding that I showed you was that the involvement of prefrontal regions in this quite complicated behavior depends on your expertise and the details of the task that you have to perform. So let me also sort of thank the people who were heavily involved in these studies. Miriam Mosing did the behavior genetic analysis together with Karin Verwey in part. Örjan de Manzano was a main person behind the imaging studies. Helene Eriksson made these interviews. The improvisation studies are then part of Anna-Louisa Pinho's thesis work, and we're of course grateful for many important collaborations here in Stockholm with Nancy Pedersen at the Twin Registry, also Törres Turell, Guy Madison in Umeå. This model of expertise that I showed briefly was developed together with Zach. And of course we would be nowhere without funding, and I would really like to thank Sven Salén, who early on gave us a very important grant which actually made this whole enterprise possible. At the moment we have a major program grant from the Bank of Sweden to Centenary Fund, and also support from some other places. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Fredrik. We already have people who want to ask you questions. You can take it already. Thanks very much. No?
Yes. Hello, Fredrik. You know me. I'm Robert von Bahr, and I'm your record producer. Anyway, so there is one thing I would like to ask you, and that is that you have and several others have talked about certain, when you practice a lot, certain areas of your brain tend to grow, not only in efficiency, but also in volume. Now, the skull doesn't grow, and the brain doesn't grow. Could it mean that if you practice very much music, that the brain, taking the extra volume for the music, will disadvantage some other personality traits?
Yeah.
That is that, well, you understand what I mean.
Yeah, no, but it's a funny question, but it's a good question, I think. I mean, first of all, as you know, the brain is obviously not, it's in fluid, so you won't sort of hit the skull immediately. I am, maybe someone someone in the audience would like to comment, but I'm not aware of any sort of direct trade-off effect, except that, of course, in generally in expertise, you know, there are only 24 hours per day, so what you sort of if you specialize a lot in one direction, you will have less time to specialize in other direction. And I think that's regarded as a main explanation for the fact that you sometimes see, for instance, negative correlations between verbal and mathematical ability, that you sort of invest your general capacity in different directions. But
yes, but those volumes are staying, aren't they? I mean, they are not volumes that will be there just when you practice music. They will stay also when you sleep. Which means that there is less other grey matter or white matter or whatever matter for other things.
Well, I mean, you're assuming that the total volume of the brain stays constant. That's not necessarily the case, right?
Well, it would have, wouldn't it? The skull doesn't work.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. You have some space to grow, you know, it's not...
Oh, right. Okay, fine, thanks.
I think a question up there to the right.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
I wonder what is your view about an alternative interpretation I'd like to give about the deactivation of the frontal cortex, which is that good improvisation goes with the suspension of censorship. And the worst thing that an artist can do is to self-censor. So when you have
yes.
deactivation, you have minimal censorship.
Yes.
What is your reaction to that?
No, I totally agree that this could be one part of it. We have also sort of discussed whether these kind of deactivations could also reflect a kind of psychological flow state, and one important part of the flow state is exactly what you mentioned, that you have less self-awareness, less self-monitoring, less sort of self-critical censoring and so on and so forth. So yes, definitely, but perhaps in some situations you can't allow this because you're not enough sort of fluent in the particular creative task that you got, so you need more cognitive control.
Well, in that case, you are not a top-rate artist. I mean,
sorry?
a top-rate artist would know exactly his material very well and can let go.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah.
Thing. Well,
sorry, it's not on.
Yes, one of the consequences of early music training, you say, was an augmented working memory, especially for music information. And I think that's interesting. Do you have any comments about that? Just for musical material and not language?
So what we found, well, I don't think I have the slides now, but what we looked at there was a phenomenon which has been described earlier in studies as well. So. The baseline task was a sort of conventional working memory task where you should memorize visual spatial structures, so dots in a grid. The musical task was that you should remember musical notation. And what we found then was that the playing twin had a better memory for musical notation, but not in general for visual spatial stimuli, which is similar to what has been shown. Also, this is well known that this is the case for musicians as compared to non-musicians, but here we demonstrate that although we sort of control for genetic factors. Well, yes, I think expertise, I think, is a kind of specialization process. So what goes on is that through several years, you optimize the system to deal with the kind of information that you need in your domain of expertise optimally. So that's what's going on.
Okay, I think the final question is down here.
Thank you for an excellent lecture. I have a question. Many of us who have been working here at the Karolinska Institute, we were playing when we entered medical school and so on, and the hard, tough work here was not easy to combine with training. And among those who are emeritus, as I am nowadays, there's a lot of people who have taken on to play instruments or to sing at a high age, so to say. And we have heard a rumor that it's very good for our brain cortex to start playing again. And have you any evidence in that direction?
Okay, yeah, so we have not looked at aging, but I'm sure you are right. As far as I've heard, I think activity is a key variable for healthy and successful aging, both physical and mental activity. And there are several studies showing beneficial effects of making music when you're older as well. So yes, I strongly believe that's the case.
Okay.